Hello, and welcome to the second installment of Miss James Reads The Smart Aleck's Guide. Yesterday we started Chapter 5. There's a 10-minute segment on that. This is the second part, so if you haven't listened to the first part yet, you go back and listen to the first part. Pick up your books, everyone, or open up your Google Classroom because it's all scanned in there, and turn to page 137, The Age of Invention. Remember, this is called the Gilded Age in the late 1800s to the early 1900s because the idea to gild something means to take something that's made of a cheap material of some kind and cover it in a thin layer of gold or something else to make it look like it's a really expensive material. Life in the United States in the late 1800s to the early 1900s was kind of like that. If you looked at the surface, there were some extremely rich people who were doing crazy things like smoking $100 bills and buying their dogs really expensive collars made out of diamonds, stuff like that that's just crazy. But most people, if you just scratch that surface, most people's lives were fairly miserable. Okay, the Age of Invention. With the gold rush over and most of the free land grabs taken, countless Americans hit on a new way to get rich: inventing things. New inventions were appearing all the time in the late 19th century, and several of them were things that we could hardly live without nowadays. Countless people invested every cent they had trying to get inventions off the ground, and even many of the successful inventors ended up in poverty. Charles Goodyear became absolutely obsessed with making a new kind of rubber that wouldn't melt or stink the way most rubber did, and the fact that he didn't know the first thing about chemistry didn't hold him back a bit. He sold everything he owned and borrowed money from everyone he knew to buy more rubber for experiments, nearly died of the fumes more than once, and even ended up in jail once before finally coming up with the new kind of rubber that neither melted nor stank. Unfortunately for him, but fortunately for rubber fans everywhere, his formula was easy to copy and he died poor and disappointed. The Goodyear company that makes tires and stuff was named after him, but he never got any money from it. Another guy named Walter Hunt invented a sewing machine, but decided not to patent it for fear that it would put seamstresses out of work. He then invented the safety pin and sold all the rights to it for about $400. That was decent money at the time, but the guy who bought the rights got seriously rich. Other people did strike it rich because of, and became famous for, their inventions. Alexander Graham Bell, along with his assistant Thomas Watson, invented the telephone. 4 years later, there were 60,000 phones in the United States. In those days, you couldn't actually dial phones. You picked up the phone and said, "Hello, Central, get me Henry Whittington, Esquire, please. I want to tell him his wife is ugly and his feet smell." And the operator at Central would connect you. Anyone else who happened to be on the line could listen in too, if they felt like it. Listening to people over the phone on these party lines, which remained common in small towns in particular for decades, became a good way to pick up gossip, and was entirely legal, if not particularly polite. You could even chime in and say you happen to know that Henry's wife smelled like roses, if you wanted. Mansfield had a party line phone system up until, I don't know, probably not all that long ago, probably about 15 years ago, where you had your prefix, and then you had the 489, and then the last 4 digits of your phone number, 3 of them were the same as everybody else in your area, and the last digit was unique to you. So if you dialed the same 3 first numbers, and then a slightly off last number, in my house growing up, the phone rang a slightly different ring, and you knew that that one wasn't supposed to be for you. By that point in time, they weren't still using the party line. It only ever happened if people dialed the wrong number. But occasionally that would happen where they'd dial the wrong last number, and the phone would give this funny ring, and we'd know that was the party line system. But no inventor became more famous than Thomas Edison, who held 1,093 patents. The irony here is that he didn't really invent much of anything. Many of the inventions were actually made by his staff. Others were things that other people invented. Edison just modified them slightly and took all the credit for them. There are plenty of nasty things you can say about Edison. For example, when he wanted to show the world that his competitor's brand of electricity was dangerous, he electrocuted an elephant. He also encouraged the use of electricity to execute a condemned criminal. Then again, it can't be denied that the inventions he's credited with, and certainly helped promote, still benefit us today. In fact, odds are pretty good that you can see this page because of an electric light. In addition to getting the credit for inventing the bulbs, at least 20 people invented versions of light bulbs before him, his was simply better, Edison played a huge role in wiring the country for electricity in the first place. Providing electricity to cities is where Edison made his real money. In the 19th century, there were inventions and discoveries that led, eventually, to just about every major technological breakthrough of the 20th century, from televisions to computers to all sorts of weapons. Not bad, considering that many people back then still thought that if you left some corn on a rag in the corner of the barn, the corn kernels would turn into mice. I'm sorry, I have no idea what that's about. I can't explain that one. Immigration. In 1830, only 1 in 100 Americans had been born in another country. In 1850, it was 1 in 10. The number of Americans who came to America between 1815 and 1915 was roughly the equivalent of the entire modern populations of Norway, Sweden, Ireland, Denmark, Austria, and Switzerland combined, somewhere around 35 million. The government set up several processing stations to handle all the necessary paperwork and examinations of new arrivals, the most famous of which was on Ellis Island, just outside New York City. Seeing the Statue of Liberty. What year? You have to know this for your Constitution test. Tick, 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 tick. 1886. It's 1886. Seeing the Statue of Liberty looming on the horizon after weeks in a smelly boat must have been pretty amazing. Certainly more inspiring than seeing the butt end of the statue from the New Jersey Turnpike is today. But there were plenty of horror stories about arriving at Ellis Island. Fresh off the boat, immigrants were thoroughly examined, poked and prodded, then often assigned a new, more American name, if they were lucky enough not to be turned away. Actually, while the place was crowded, it was built to process about 1,000 people per day, but often had to process about 5 times that many. Only about 1 in 50 people were turned away, mostly due to illness, and very few people were actually forced to change their name. Millions, however, did voluntarily change their names, sometimes to make them easier to spell, and sometimes to forget their past and start fresh in their new home. A great many immigrants had no choice but to stay in whatever city they landed in, since they couldn't afford to travel any further. Hence, New York became a major immigration center. For example, about 1/3 of all Jews in Europe came to America. European countries were in the habit of kicking Jews out. Most stayed in New York, and there were soon more Italians in New York City than in most Italian cities. Most of these immigrants, especially the ones who weren't white, had a rough time in America, but white immigrants didn't get treated that well either. In the late 1800s, many stores that needed to hire someone put signs in their windows saying, "No Irish need apply." Anti-Irish prejudice was rampant. If one group can truly claim to have been worse off than everyone else, it's probably the Chinese. In 1882, the government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration. Its real purpose was to keep the Chinese from coming to California and getting the gold that white people were already digging for, and to keep the Chinese who were already present from becoming citizens. The act wouldn't be repealed for 61 years, in 1943. And if you remember back to last year when we played the Oregon Trail game, why were there so many Chinese people in the United States in the first place? Oh, all of you with your hands up? Fantastic. Great job, guys. If you can't remember, it's because they were building the Transcontinental Railroad, that we couldn't get enough Americans to do the work because the work was really hard and backbreaking and you were likely to die or get seriously injured, and so we actually went to other countries like China and invited people to come to the United States to do this pretty terrible labor. But as soon as that Transcontinental Railroad gets finished in 1869, we immediately turn around and by 1882 have passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Those Chinese who were already present had been treated very badly from the start. In some places, especially in the West, mobs attacked Chinese settlements, killing some and wounding others. Those who fought back weren't even allowed to plead self-defense in court if they were arrested for fighting a white person. There may not have been signs saying, "No Chinese need apply," but that was only because it went without saying. Okay, look at the top corner of page 141. At the little tiny political cartoon up there. Okay, you're good enough at political cartoons. This one's pretty tiny, but I want you to look at it and see what you can make out of it. It says, "The great fear of the period, that Uncle Sam will be consumed by foreigners." To be consumed means to be used up, to be eaten by, in this case. You look at who your three main characters. Uncle Sam is the one in the middle. You can see the traditional pants and coat. The guy on the left is supposed to be, yes? A leprechaun, very good, representing the Irish immigrants. And the one on the right, yeah, very stereotypical racist depiction of a Chinese immigrant at the time. And if you look at the top panel there, the globe is in the background, it's supposed to be the world, and they are consuming Uncle Sam from both ends. Then if you go down to the left, it says the problem solved, and they're continuing to consume Uncle Sam, chomp, chomp, chomp. And then in the last panel there, to the right of that, the Chinese immigrant has eaten the leprechaun as well and stolen his hat. It says, we here at the Smart Alex Guide aren't sure we fully understand this cartoon, but we're pretty sure that it's horribly offensive. I think that sums it up nicely. Alright, well that's today's installment. We are done reading for today. We will continue on with this chapter later. Bye.